Hello. So I'm going to go through some ideas about structure in Blessing with the aim of thinking more generally about how to approach structural analysis in poems, because I think it's very useful to know what kinds of things are we looking for when we're analysing a poem, especially as part of your literature exam it involves an unseen poem that you have to analyse. Um, and also, what does that look like when we write about it? So we don't want to just be identifying poetic devices and going, right, well done me, I've spotted that there's some enjambment there, or a caesura. What you need to be thinking about is exactly what effects those are having. And that can be trickier sometimes with structural techniques. So we're going to have a look at a few examples, but particularly focusing our attention on the poem Blessing by Imtiaz Dharka. Okay, so here's the poem on the left, and I'm not going to read through that. You can read through it. A little note before we start, which is that when you're writing, do try to use the words stanza, line, poem, poet, just so that you're kind of using the language of poetic analysis. So it's fine to use writer or author, but generally speaking, when we're thinking about a poem, it would be poet. And also really do avoid using verse or paragraph or sentence, unless you are talking about the sentence within the poem. We might touch on this later, but you can see that one sentence here runs from the word from the huts, a congregation, every man, woman, child for streets around, butts in with pots, and that sentence runs to the end of the poem. Now that is something interesting for you to talk about, but if you are talking about a line, which often you are when you're talking about a poem, then use the word line. If you're talking about the sentence, use the word sentence, because there is a difference between those two things. A sentence begins with a capital letter and ends with a full stop. And here you can see that this sentence runs over a whole host of lines, even across two stanzas. So do try to use those words as you kind of orientate your essay in the poem. Now, to start with, before we kind of get into what different devices mean and how you could sort of spot them and think about them, here's an example of me sort of building on analysis as I think about a series of structural choices that the writer has probably, that the poet's probably made. So I'm asking myself these questions. Does the poet, and this goes for all of the devices that we'll look at across this video, does the poet use juxtaposition? And my answer, having read Blessing, is yes. Now, you might disagree with me. I think there is a sort of contrast or juxtaposition between, and I've said it here, so let me read this out. So Dharka juxtaposes the skin that cracks like a pod in the first stanza with the sudden rush of water in the second and third. So I think there's a sort of difference between the dryness of that description at the beginning with obviously the water in the rest of the poem. Now, when you're talking about structure, what you want to try to do is think about how other structural choices, maybe also linguistic ones, feed into that idea. So how do they support, reiterate, reinforce that idea that you've already got about the contrast, the juxtaposition? So I might ask myself about the phonology. Now, don't be scared by that word. It just means the sound of the poem. So when you're talking about phonemes or phonetics, you're talking about the sound. So is it reflected in the sound of the poem from that first stanza to the second and third? And how so? So here's my answer to that. This is reflected in the poet's phonological choices. The plosive k in the first line, which illustrates the harshness of the lack of water on the body, is contrasted with the consonants of splash, rush, crashes, onomatopoeic words that create the sound of water flowing freely. Don't worry if you don't know what those words mean fully. We'll sort of touch on those in the next couple of slides. Now, that's fine, but maybe I want to build on that even more and think about, well, on a kind of line stanza level, does the structure, how the poem's arranged in terms of where the lines are broken and where you move on to a new line and move on to a new stanza, is that contrast reflected there as well? And this is a great phrase to use when you're sort of backing something up and wanting to support it with extra evidence. The phrase "in fact," because you're basically saying to the examiner, "Here's another thing that I want to say about the poem." In fact, the enjambed lines in the third stanza contribute to this sudden rush that seems almost uncontrollable. The lists that run over numerous lines and even stanzas convey how the water bursts onto the scene. This feeling is heightened by the stark contrast in tone between the first stanza and the remainder of the poem. The end-stopped lines, can you see that in the first stanza? There's a full stop at the end of each line. This isn't usually the case in poetry. And you can see that from the rest of the stanzas. You can see that there's not a single end-stopped line until, there's one there at the end of the second stanza, and then there's not one until the end of the poem. So it is unusual, and that's something to kind of notice in a poem, particularly in Blessing, where it's quite obvious that there are this couplet, I suppose you could call it, of two end-stopped lines. And I've said that creates a solemn and desperate emptiness, since there never is enough water. But you might think, well, actually, it creates sort of kind of finality that this is not something that they can escape from, and actually, it's just it's a lucky coincidence that this pipe ends up bursting. Actually, they're sort of destined, fated for drought and thirst at the beginning. And I guess that links in with the ideas around God and religion in the poem. But anyway, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent. Let's read this. So, create a solemn and desperate emptiness, since there never is enough water. But the free-flowing enjambment, that's where the sentence runs over more than one line. So you can see that's happening a lot in this poem. Imagine the drip of it, the small splash of it. This is one sentence, isn't it? But it's running over numerous lines. So the lines are enjambed, or the writer's using enjambment. The free-flowing enjambment in the rest of the poem is both chaotic and liberating. Now you can see the reason I put arrows here is because you can see how I'm building on my structural analysis. I'm not just sort of saying one thing. I'm building on it, and you can see I've underlined the different techniques that I'm focusing on as I consider the effects within the poem. Okay, so that's an example and something you could sort of use, and it's worth sort of picking out my phrases and just having a go at writing about another poem or this one, but saying something else. So, use phrases, like jot them down and learn them. This is reflected in the poet's phonological, structural, linguistic choices. And phrases like which illustrates, that create the in fact. We talked about that one, didn't we? This feeling is heightened by. So try to kind of use those phrases and have an inventory of phrases that you can draw on as you're writing about poems. Okay, let's dip into a few different devices that we can think about to do with this poem, but also that you can apply to other poems. Okay, first then, the phonology. We touched on this, but phonology, sound. There are two broad categories of phonology when you're looking at poetry, and that's assonance and consonance. So assonance is repeated vowel sounds. So you can see that on a sort of minimal level with this beginning of the third stanza, the sudden rush, So you've got the repeated sound, which is a vowel sound, isn't it? And so that's an example of assonance. Consonance, of course, is repeated consonant sounds. Now, there are some more specific, I'm not going to go into all of them because there are lots, but there are three that you might be able to draw on as you think about poems in the anthology and in Unseen. Here are three examples of consonants. So they're sort of subsets of consonants. They come under that broad category. So fricative sounds are f sounds, all right? And that's found in the poem where it says, and the flow has found Now, a note here, because you might think, well, how on earth do I work out what the specific effect of the flow has found and the repeated f sound is? I have no idea is the answer to that. In terms of this poem, you have to do a bit of thinking about it. In terms of this poem, I'd say that actually the writer is deliberately using a lot of consonants and assonants across the poem, and maybe that's to add to the sort of musicality of the event. So you've got the idea of the roar of tongues. There's lots of onomatopoeia in there, burst, splash, drip, and maybe it creates a kind of almost a worship around the emergence of this water. It's almost, maybe it reflects the kind of the flow of the water. There's like a sort of song, but also maybe the worship of the congregation, every man, woman, and child, the streets around. So that might be the angle I'd take on it with blessing, but it depends on the poem. Maybe okay, this is a bit dark, but maybe think of a poem that's all about a corpse, and one of the lines goes, I'm literally making this up off the top of my head, but if one of the lines goes, the flump of the fusty body as it fell on the sofa. Okay, so you've got the sound running through there. Okay, and maybe it's to echo the kind of that sound of the body kind of. I don't even know if flump is a word, but the body kind of being chucked onto the sofa. Let's park that and carry on with blessing. Plosive sounds, they're b, p, k, t, d. Okay, harsh sounds, we often use them when we're swearing. So they're sort of signs of aggression, and not always signs of aggression. I mean, maybe they echo a particular sound that the writer wants to create, but often they're aggressive sounds. Here, though, you can see this most obviously perhaps in the list. So I haven't included the entire list, but it's there with plastic buckets. You can hear the buck. Can you hear that sound? It almost sounds like beatboxing. But you can also see it in this one, butts in with pots, brass, copper, aluminium. So you've got the sound. Okay, now you can think about that, but I think it sounds like that chaos of all of these buckets and the hands and the long list of sort of objects and things as they scurry and hurry to try and get the water before it sort of goes into the ground, evaporates or whatever. Okay, so it kind of echoes that chaos of the moment, but also the joy, because the sound of everything and it's the screams and the flow of the roar of tongues. They're singing. It's a beautiful picture, isn't it? So while I said aggression, I think here it's probably meant to sort of create the sound of everything kind of coming together in that moment. Sibilant sounds, so sh, okay, and they can, of course, you've got to apply it to the poem. What do you think that sound is contributing to? And often the answer will be in the language of that line. Okay, so in this one, sometimes the sudden rush was talking, isn't it, about the water, right? So which hasn't yet happened in the poem, but the municipal pipe bursts, right? So it's talking about that moment of water, the contrast between the drip that usually comes into the tin mug from the pipe, from the tap, but now a sort of a rush. And so maybe the shh is meant to kind of echo the sound of the water pouring out of the pipe when it bursts. But again, like I said, you have got to look for the clues in the language. What is it that's happening in the poem at that moment that means the writer has made these phonological choices, that the writer's chosen to create those sounds within their poem? Okay, the title. This is one thing to really focus on, particularly in an unseen poem. I say particularly because I think it's your first clue as to what the poem is going to be about. So here are some questions for you to think about. I'm not going to apply this to blessing. You can think about this in your own time and about any of poems that you practice on. But how does the title relate to the rest of the poem? What's it got to do with the poem? Now, when you've read the poem, you can work out why that title has been chosen. And it's a significant structural choice that the writer's made. So it's something to think about. What's the title adding to this poem? If it wasn't there, what would the difference be? And what does it make you think before reading the poem? So this is really to do with how the writer sets the scene, I suppose. What kind of tone do they establish at the beginning? How does it orientate us in the setting, if it does at all? This one doesn't really tell us anything about the setting, but some poems titles will. And what connotations does the word have? It might sound like you're doing linguistic analysis there, but you're thinking about why X at that point. Yeah. So whatever you're talking about, even if you're talking about language, if you're talking about why it is placed there in the poem, then you're making a structural point. Okay, repetition. Now, there's obviously direct repetition when a writer repeats a particular idea, maybe the beginning of a line. That would be anaphora. Some people call it anaphora. I think that sounds like a person, but anaphora. Whatever. Okay, I haven't really touched on repetition in this because there isn't any examples of direct repetition in blessing, really. But there are repeated ideas or repeated uses of language. So if you're talking about the writer using the semantic field of religion or a religious lexis, that just means words, so words to do with religion or religious things, then you are saying, you're making a structure-like point, because you're saying the writer's chosen these particular words and has clustered them within this poem for a reason. The imagery of light, that kind of emerges towards the end of the poem with liquid sun, highlights, flashing light, so polished. So you've got the idea of light at the end, and especially if you're saying that at the end, in the final stanza, there's lots of imagery to do with light, you are saying something structural about the poem. And also here, particularly, the title later in the poem. Where does the title emerge again in the poem? That's worth considering. The structure of poetry, generally, it's worth knowing what these things mean. So we talked about enjambment. Caesurae is the plural, caesura is the singular, and there's two examples in this poem. A few examples in this poem, three maybe, probably count the colon, where the sentence ends within a line. You can think about the effects of that. Line breaks. The poet has chosen to finish each line on this word. So you've got to ask, why has she moved on to a new line at that point? The rhyme scheme, there isn't one. So it's not, in this one, there's not a rhyme scheme. There's not really a great deal of rhyme. There are some half rhymes, it was said, assonance, consonants, and things like that. But have a think, if there is a rhyme scheme, why are those two words rhymed? Are they linked? Are those two lines linked in any way? Does the rhyme scheme establish a sense of kind of security, or maybe it contrasts a complete lack of security in the poem? I don't know. These phrases are often used when the poet is kind of where the lines, within the stanzas are do rhyme or adhere to some kind of rhyme scheme. But you can use them sort of generally as well. So couplet, 2 lines in a stanza; tercet, 3 lines in a stanza; quatrain, 4; quintet, 5. Yeah, so on, so on. So these are, I suppose you could call this a quatrain, the second stanza. But we tend to use those when we're talking about something within a regular rhyme scheme, so like in a sonnet or something. Is it blank verse, rhymed verse? Blank verse is just where there's a rhythm in the poem, often iambic pentameter, but blank would be where it's not rhymed. So it's just, there is a rhythm, but it's no rhymes at the end. Or rhymed verse, where there is a rhyme scheme. Free verse, where there's not a kind of regular rhythm or rhyme scheme, and there isn't here. You've got a few rhymes, haven't you? Ground, found, around there, so that might be worth looking at. I didn't spot that on the first reading. Or prose, poetry won't often be written in prose. Rhythm, is there a rhythm? So iambic pentameter in a sonnet. Great, I think that's it. Yes, that's it. So do sort of have another watch maybe, and sort of have a go at this first thing where you're kind of using all those structural things we talked about and trying to write in a way that's convincing. Hopefully that was helpful.